Hello, and welcome to Under 1000. My name's Thomas Flower, and each episode I'll read you a new piece of flash fiction. All of the stories are 1,000 words or less. Today, I'll be reading Bread and Fire. The world was on fire. I went to the shops to buy some bread. As I stood in the bakery aisle, I tried to decide between the myriad meaningless choices laid out before me. White, brown, sourdough, artisan, organic, cheap, brands which promised to make you healthier, brands which promised to stop the world burning just a little, brands which sold the fantasy of a life where we all might live happily. I thought about what I could afford, whether I could spring for the fancy expensive bread I liked, or whether I should eke out a cheap and dry white sliced loaf for the next week, in hope of having any savings left worth talking about. Then I remembered that the world was on fire and that the bomb might drop any moment, and that it seemed more likely that I would perish in some preventable disaster than ever see out retirement. I bought a large, fancy, expensive loaf. As I stood in front of the cashier to pay, I thought I could see something in her eyes. Something that screamed out at me, questioning how it had come to this and why, 1,000,000 miles away, people were dying needlessly as the world burnt around them and collapsed. I thought I saw rage and anger and frustration in her eyes, and I thought that maybe she would vault the counter screaming, "The hell with it all!" and take to smashing up the shelves in a recklessly futile attempt at making any kind of change to the world as it presently existed. Instead, she sighed and said, "That'll be £2.50, please." On the street outside, everything was calm. I wondered why. People were walking around busily, rushing here and there underneath the last rays of the sun. What was the point of it all? I didn't have an answer, but I did have some bread. In the stairwell, I saw my neighbour, leaving his flat and coming down as I went up. I smiled, trying to catch his eye. He wouldn't look at me, shuffling past guiltily as though he had done something wrong. I wasn't sure what had made him feel like this, and yet simultaneously I knew exactly why, and I wondered if I should be acting as shiftily and despondently as well. Perhaps trying to smile in the face of all this was the truly irrational response. I unlocked the door, wondering whether my feelings were appropriate at all. There wasn't much to eat for dinner. Bread, cheese, a can of beans. I suppose I should have bought more when I had the opportunity, but the prospect of having an existential crisis in the frozen aisle seemed pretty unappealing. Was it wrong to still be eating cheese at a time like this? I wasn't sure if I knew or even cared much anymore. Somewhere, out there, the world kept spinning and burning and spinning and burning. I ate my meal, filled my belly for another night. After I had cleared up, I tried to sit and watch some shows, in a vain attempt to unwind. It didn't seem to work. Nothing appealed. The laughter and smiles of the characters only irritated me. I wanted to break inside the glass between us and scream at them to stop. How could they be carrying on at a time like this? How could they be acting smart and cracking wise when people were dying? I realized I was angry at myself, at the person I had just watched moving through the day normally, my own eyes acting like the TV now sitting in front of me. I switched it off and sat in silence for a moment. Was this what I deserved? What we deserved? I had not done this. I would not have chosen it if given a choice. I knew, as we all knew by now, that it was only a small select group who were causing all this catastrophe. And yet I still participated in this fatally broken society. Still carried on with the crowds as though life could continue this way forever. But what were we all meant to do? No alternatives presented themselves to us, so we condemned ourselves to death out of fear and dismay. It didn't matter anyway. As I lay in bed, I wondered what would happen next. It's so strange the way in which we think that we can see the course of history as it unravels itself before us. We suppose that our predictions will come true, and yet instead all any of us can do is watch as each new development transpires and then is frozen into the history books as an obvious and inevitable outcome. what outcome would we have? Would our predictions prove true? For once, it seemed we hoped they would not, and yet our fatal pathway looked clear. We were reminded daily how we had precious little time left to save ourselves, and yet we went on eating chips and buying bread and watching sitcoms about people in wacky and outrageous situations getting up to hijinks. We were in an outrageous situation. It did not feel wacky. It felt terrifying. My thoughts were overwhelming me. Frantically exhausted, I closed my eyes. I tried to picture something else, somewhere that did not look like our present home. I tried to forget what I knew, and not to think about it. The world was on fire. I went to sleep, and did not dream. Thank you for listening to Under 1000. I'm your host, Thomas Flower. To follow the show online, look for Under 1000 Pod on Twitter or Facebook. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, go to patreon.com/under1000pod, where you can sign up to read each month's stories in advance, as well as to have a thank you be read during these credits. The theme music is an instrumental version of In Between Days by Nick Tate and the Sharks. To hear the full song and more from the same EP, go to Nick Tate, NICTATE, and thesharks.bandcamp.com, or search for them on your favourite streaming platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and that you'll join me again next time for some more super short fiction.